Hello, everybody. Thank you for watching. In this talk, I have Thomas Smale. How do I pronounce it? I should have asked.
Smale. You're
Smale.
close.
There we go. Thomas Smale from FE International Brokers here to talk to us about selling the business and what it's like. Some case studies of like what it's been like for other people going through this process. Because I don't know about you, but I work best, I learn best, and I remember best when I'm talking about case studies and live examples. So this is the Build, Scale, Sell Summit. We're going to talk about the sell part with Thomas, and we're going to do some case studies. So first of all, thank you, Thomas, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Thanks for having me. Well, thanks for inviting me.
Welcome. So let's start with a case study. Obviously, we're not going to say names, and we might not necessarily say exact dollar figures or things like that, because let's be confidential. But is there an online service business that you've got in mind that you want to start with talking about?
Yeah, so we've worked with a lot of businesses over the years. So 10 years of running a business, we've sold over 800 now. A lot of those in the service space. One thing I'd say before I go into some specific case studies is we've seen a lot of businesses that don't necessarily start out as sellable businesses, or they don't even necessarily start out as service businesses, but when they start thinking about selling, they begin to pivot. So in this case, this was a business where the owner of the business, he was the entire brand. The only person people knew was him.
Mm-hmm.
I won't tell you his name, but he was the brand. He had a website as well, and the website itself was not necessarily named after him, but it was, if you mentioned his name or the blog, you would compare the two basically exactly. So for many years, he was selling various different things on there, which I guess were a combination of services and products, which were often combined. So it might be, I will do X for you with this product, or whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm.
And people were coming and paying him because they wanted his service. So he got to the stage where that was quite profitable, doing well, but realized that he didn't really want to be doing that long term and wanted a bit of I'd say like a life pivot or business pivot, but realized that he had clearly found an industry that was popular, had found a way to bring in buyers or customers. And I guess importantly, particularly in the service business, you had people that were coming back time and time again. So it wasn't just people coming in once, buying his products and services, and then never coming back again. They were turning into like raving fans. So at the time, he had things like a Facebook group, he had a podcast, and he was the host. He was the one who saw in the Facebook group. He had a small team of kind of VAs and outsourcers doing some of the work, but he was the one doing all the sales. He was doing everything. So we had a conversation, I'd say probably many years before he thought about selling. We actually met at an event which I think you and I have been to before in the past, and maybe met as well. He started the conversation. I think at the time he didn't think there was any chance of his business ever being sellable. We sat down. I think we had a few drinks, and we started thinking about his business, and we realized that most people, when they start a service business, think that they are the only one who can deliver that service. I know 10 years ago when I started FE International, I was convinced that it was possible to find anyone who could do what I could then. But now, 10 years on, 50 employees later, I realize that's not the case, and everyone I hire is better than me at a specific part or parts of the process behind our service. He was exactly the same in his business, and I kind of gave him some, I guess, almost like case studies of what we've done, what I've seen elsewhere. So the first thing he did was hired an operations manager. He realized that he liked the marketing side of the business, but he really hated operations. It wasn't that he was disorganized, but there were so many orders coming in. There were so many different things he could have been offering or upselling or improving, but he just didn't want to do it. He was effectively just getting an order, forwarding it to an outsourcer, maybe adding it to a CRM, but that was about it. There was no further thought beyond that. And I think from a customer perspective, while people liked him, the feedback about the service probably wasn't as good as it could have been, just because of the fact the process on the back end was not that great. So the first thing he did was, when we started thinking about the sale process, and he knew it would take at least a year to get there, was hired an operations manager. So someone that came in and their only job, the guy he hired did not like sales, didn't want to do any sales, didn't want to do any marketing, didn't want to be CEO of the business. All he wanted to do was operations. So he loved making processes, he loved CRMs, he loved dealing with the team and the outsourcers, loved organizing things. But he had no interest in the other side of the business. So that worked really well. He came in, he got paid well. And that was one thing that when we started discussing bringing this person in, the owner of the business was reluctant to pay, I'd say, like a good salary. And what a good salary is really depends on where you are based in the world, what your experience is. But for him, he was based in Southeast Asia. So to him, like a good salary was maybe like $1,000 a month or $1,500 a month. I think, without going into the exact numbers, I think he ended up paying the operations manager somewhere around $100,000 a year, which in most places in the world is a very good salary.
Yeah.
So that was a lot more than he was comfortable paying, and he immediately was making less money than he was before because he suddenly had, let's call it $10,000 a month going out of the business that wasn't going out before. But the knock-on effect that he didn't really expect is I encouraged him that while this may feel like an expense on the back end, you should see an ROI. You shouldn't always look at hiring people as a cost. You will generate extra revenue. So even though this guy wasn't doing any sales, he effectively was, because the service was suddenly getting delivered better, faster, it was high quality, there were less errors. So customers were happier. I guess the quicker you deliver a service, the more likely they are to come back and order again. So previously it was taking a month to deliver the service. It was now taking 2 weeks. So they would say, okay, well, I want to order again, and then again. So it would effectively be making more and more money because of the fact those same customers were coming back faster. The other thing which a lot of people don't really think about is it really freed up the owner's time to work on the things that he liked the most. So he could then spend his time doing marketing, and the ops manager could do what he liked doing, which was ops. So there were lots of benefits, and effectively that meant that even though he was paying him $100,000 a year, which he thought was crazy and thought was way more than he should have been paying, because you can get people cheaper elsewhere, which is true. A really good operations manager, and this was not a business making millions a year. It was a good, profitable business, but it wasn't a 10 million a year revenue business. So 100,000 salary was still a lot of money. In that case, he structured most of it as salary. I think a lot of people make the mistake of effectively trying to hire a business partner, where they're like, okay, I'll pay you $1,000 a month and then 25% of profits or 50% of profits or something like that. But what you tend to find with, at least in my experience and what he found, if you're an operations minded person, you probably don't think too much about sales. You just want to know that by delivering the same thing over and over again, you're going to get a consistent salary. So he didn't have any equity in the business. I think by the time the business sold, he had a small amount, but it wasn't significant. So he didn't have to give up a huge amount of profit, but he did have to pay a good salary. Like I said, that came back in the form of added revenue and I guess like bandwidth for him as the owner to go do what he wanted, which was market the business. So the next thing he did, once he had the operations manager in place, the operations manager could then hire more people, did lots of good stuff on the operations side. The next challenge was getting the business away from being kind of 100% reliant on the brand of the owner of the business. So we knew, even entering into the sales process, once we actually like listed the business and started looking for a buyer, that it was going to be impossible to completely remove him from that forever. So as part of that process, we kind of set expectations early on with him that he would need to be involved probably for at least 12 months post-sale, just in the form of like having his name there, being seen in the Facebook group, and things like that. So I think sometimes if you are thinking about selling a business and you realize that removing yourself is important, sometimes the final tiny bit that you need to remove is not worth the amount of effort it might be required to completely remove it. So you might be best just to accept the fact that the business is going to be a bit reliant on you, or there's a couple of hours a week that are reliant on you, versus spending 6 months and thinking no one's ever going to buy your business if you're still involved. Because that's really not the case. It just makes it a little bit more difficult. But I mean, ultimately, that's really what you pay us for. It's not really, you shouldn't have to worry too much about that.
Yeah.
So the next thing he did was he had a podcast, and most people think podcasts are impossible to hand over. There's no way anyone else can take over as the host. And what he found is that he was being, I'm sure he won't mind me saying this if he listens to this and realizes I'm talking about him, he was just being lazy with the podcast. I don't have a podcast myself, but the ones I've seen that are successful, every week or every day or every 2 weeks, they publish an episode. His was like once every 6 weeks, and then he published like 3 in a week, then nothing for a month. And it was just, the content was good, this wasn't very consistent. So while people liked it, they could have been much more successful. He was convinced that it was impossible to bring in someone else. So what we did, and I won't take all the credit because he was really the one that did it, but brought in a co-host initially. So he was paying him by the episode, and the co-host had to source the guests, come up with a topic, like plan all of the kind of editing, the post-episode promotion, so things like writing an email, sending out to list, making sure that the speaker or the guest was happy, making sure it was promoted on social media, all of that stuff. So that guy came in, quite young, like really keen to impress. I think they did something like 10 episodes together, and then the seller of the business realized actually the guy he brought in was much better at podcasting than he was. Every single week he wanted to do an episode. He got some really good guests. He's putting loads of effort in. The guests really liked it. I feel like guests are more likely to be engaged if you put the effort in. I feel like it's much harder to get people to, particularly if you want like bigger names, much harder to get people to turn up if they feel like it's disorganized or your episode might be published in 4 months' time. So that worked really well. And then after those 10 weeks of episodes, he just rolled off entirely. It wasn't as if he was never mentioned again, but the episode started referring to the business. And the nature of the podcast as well was it was not all about the business every time. It was things that would be good content for customers of the business, but it wasn't like a business update podcast. So it wouldn't be like me having a podcast and talking about what FE International has done this month. It wasn't anything like that. It was all talking about good content that was relevant to their audience. So that worked really well. And he also had a Facebook group. I know Facebook groups are really popular now, people building communities. So with that was kind of simple. He also got the podcast to not take over the group, but start answering questions in there. Sometimes the operations manager would go in there, not to do public-facing things, but if there were, not necessarily complaints, but people asking about like, oh, can you give me an update on my order, or I don't know where this is, he would go in and kind of answer it and be like, yeah, hey Sarah, I'm going to be in touch. I'm going to make sure that you get this, or no worries, you sorted you out. We've actually added a little bit more to your order because we took some time, whatever it might be. So we no longer had to worry about the operations on one side of the business. Didn't have to worry about the Facebook group. The podcaster or the new podcast host was really proactive. He got a couple of community moderators. Like the nature of most online communities is you can hire people, not hire people, you don't need to pay them, people who will kind of help out, delete posts, remove spammers for free. So that's what he had. I think he was giving them some services for free each month. He might say, okay, here's $200 worth of services every month, or here's some credit that you can use to buy whatever you want. So that worked well for them, worked well for him, because effectively he had a steady flow of orders, but knew those people would start talking about him and recommending him. So that worked really well. So that took probably about 6 to 12 months to get all of those people in place. But in the case of this business, like it was a 7-figure exit. So again, depending where you live in the world, 7 figures, whether that's 1 million or 9 million, it's still a lot of money. And again, a lot of places you don't ever need to work again, or you can be in a position where you can at least significantly reduce the amount you have to work again. So for him, that was worth the time and effort, because previously he had a business that was effectively unsellable to a 7-figure business. And yes, the margins were worse, but the revenue was twice as high. From hours, he went from working like 40, 60 hours a week to more like 4 to 6 hours a week. And that was really just because he like refreshing his stats and stuff like that. He didn't really need to be involved in the business. He had actually better replaced himself on the marketing side, better replaced himself on the operations side. And all he really had to do was kind of send out emails, promotions, and put his like name and I guess reputation behind some things. So that worked really well. When it came to selling the business, it was super popular because lots of people in our buyer network and a lot of the acquirers we reached out to had heard of the brand or heard of the business. Some had even been customers of the business. And those that hadn't could very quickly find out with a quick Google search or social media search that the business was clearly popular, reputable, had an engaged Facebook group, had a popular podcast. I think there are things that are like quite hard to fake in a business. You can't really fake. You can obviously write fake reviews, but it's hard to kind of fake a Facebook group full of 10,000 people who are engaged talking about your business. And it wasn't like everything being discussed was great. It wasn't all amazing feedback all the time, which again I think is a good thing. Too many people in service businesses try and like cover up the bad stuff, but I think in any service business, you're going to have customers who are not happy, and the key is really like how well have you dealt with it. So I think some of the buyers would sign up, or potential buyers would sign up, look in the like Facebook group, and they would see someone saying, "Hey, where's my order? I ordered last week. I was told it would take 3 days, and I still haven't got it." And then within an hour, the operations manager had gone in and replied and already handled the issue. So from a buyer perspective, I think that gave a lot of reassurance that when we said there was a really good and reliable operations manager in place, that there really was. So like, we can say one thing in the sales materials we can put out, but buyers really want to see that and kind of believe it by seeing it in action. So that worked really well.
Makes sense.
Because it's really easy to create a kind of third-party review site where every single person has written a 5-star review. But I think in reality, people like businesses where they can see what some of the issues are, and you can kind of explain how that might be improved. So the buyer himself, the one who came through and ended up acquiring the business. So one thing that he wanted as part of the deal, and this is something we discussed with the seller up front, so it wasn't like a necessity of the deal, but it was definitely important, is he wanted the seller to stay around as an advisor for 12 months after the sale, and he got a small percentage of profits in that time. So it wasn't a significant amount of money, but it was enough to keep him, I guess, interested and engaged. And I think important, and this is important as a seller and a buyer, particularly in a business kind of built around your name and reputation. As a seller, it's in your best interest for the buyer to be successful. And as a buyer, it's in your best interest for the seller to be kind of engaged, but not too... You don't want them too engaged. You don't want them still working 40 hours a week, because then the business is still reliant on them. So it's a bit of a balancing act. A lot of people hear, "Oh, there's no way I'd ever want to stay on and do anything post-sale." But in reality, in this case, it was like an hour a week of his time committed. Most of the time, he didn't have to do anything. Most people post-sale, and this is our advice to almost anyone, if you have an exit, particularly a 7-figure exit, for most people, it's take some time out, figure out what you want to do next. Or if you've already started what you want to do next, kind of spend some time focused on that. But the reality is very few people sell and then go do literally nothing and don't even want to log on to the internet for a year. So an hour a week really isn't that much work or time and effort. And the seller, he wanted to launch another business which was not similar or competing, but it could theoretically have been selling to a similar audience. So it was important for him within the community to be seen as, to still have a good reputation, not sell the business, and then the new owner takes over. The new owner's terrible, runs the business into the ground. He's got his $1 million or however much it is, and that's not really going to help you when you go start your new business. So that worked really well, and I think because of the fact we spent some time thinking about it before he sold, he was well aware of what was going to come up as part of the sale process, and it also meant that the buyer didn't have to spend a huge amount of time negotiating over that particular point because it was already expected. And I think as a service business owner myself, I think one thing that a lot of people don't do, and one thing we've always tried really hard to do, is be really honest and open with people up front. If you know, in our case, we knew full well that buyers would be asking for the owner to hang around. So there'd be no point us lying and saying, oh, no, you can definitely get an all-cash deal, that you don't have to be involved at all. While that's not impossible, I feel like it's definitely better to set clear expectations. So that's what we did. And I feel like service businesses that do that in general tend to perform well and have happier customers. It might be a little bit harder to get them over the line at the start, but once they've started the process, signed up for your service, whatever it is, whether you're selling something for $1,000 or $100,000, I definitely think people thank you in the long run. So that ended up in ultimately a successful exit. We're about, as we speak today, about 12 months or so after the sale completed. I think the previous owner is still somewhat involved. Like, I still see him, for example, in the Facebook group. He's still semi-active, just because he likes to talk to the customers. I think the person who bought the business is doing quite well. He's launched some new services. The operations manager's still around. Some of the team have left, some have stayed. I think that's inevitable. If you're buying a service business, I think you need to realize that you're going to come in with a new style of management, and that will mean that some people will probably leave. So you should expect that when you take over. I think it's very difficult to come in and expect literally nobody to leave. Too many people come in and they say, okay, well, I'm only going to offer this deal if you can guarantee that the employees are all going to stay with business. And even, I mean, you can't do that in any business, let alone in a business you're selling. So in that case, I think expectations were very clear. The buyer knew what he was getting, and he had some quite clear ideas how he was going to grow the business. And he had some other audiences that he could tap into to launch those things. So hopefully that's a good, say, like case study or overview of how that sale worked.
That's good.
I don't know if we want to go some like questions. Or...
Yeah, I've got some questions. I'd love for you to elaborate on a couple of points. But I think that was a fantastic case study to start with, because there is this danger with service businesses that it becomes so reliant on the personal brand of the founder and the personal efforts of the founder that sometimes they do think they can't possibly sell it. So yeah, thank you for picking that one to start out with. I think it was perfect. In the beginning of it, you mentioned that you had that chat to him a few years before he was thinking of selling. How far in advance do you think people should be starting to prepare their business for sale? I mean, from day one it's great, obviously, but is there like a minimum amount of time?
I would say the easy answer is it depends. But so firstly, you should think about it from the beginning of your business, but more realistically, you should think about it once you start having some traction in your business. So that's not first customer. That might be once you're a year or two in. And then from there, what you should start thinking about is what you're trying to achieve from the business and from a potential exit. So without turning this into a valuation talk, let's say in your first year you've done $50,000 in revenue, you have no employees, so your margins are really high, all that money's gone to you, you made $50,000, and you want to sell that business for, say, $10 million. I think most people, without being valuation experts, realize that business is probably not worth $10 million. So in that case, I'd say you shouldn't really think about exit planning at all. You should really just focus on growing your revenue. I think too many people spend all their time obsessed with an exit, but they don't really think about how far away they are from that. So I think you should familiarize yourself with some of the concepts behind valuation. You don't necessarily need to engage us or another M&A firm or business broker or even marketplace, depending how big your business is. But you should start. There's lots of, I mean, we have content, lots of our competitors have content you can read about valuation. You'll get some slightly differing opinions. So definitely look for companies that have sold a lot of businesses versus those who have done it once or twice and then use that as one case study, one example, because there's lots of nuances and complexity behind it. But you should at least get the fundamentals so you know when you're within the ballpark. So in the case of this particular seller, his exit goal was 7 figures. He didn't really care when it was, and he didn't care if it was, well, he did, but he didn't. He didn't care if it was $5 million or $1 million. He just wanted to be able to say that he had a 7-figure exit. So he started thinking about it reasonably early, but he was already kind of somewhat involved in the industry, so had a working understanding of how it might work. And he had actually sold a couple of really small websites completely unrelated to his business with us in the past. And then he thought, oh, well, maybe I want to sell my service business, but assumed, at least based on some conversations he had, that it was completely impossible to sell. So say in that case, if you think you have a particularly complex business or one that you should know in your business, if you think it's going to be difficult for someone else to come in and take over. He knew, so we had that conversation quite early. And I'd say if you put the effort in to build a relationship with, I mean, we're an advisory firm, so I guess, as the name suggests, we give advice. And most of the time we only get paid if a business sells. So it's in our best interest to give good advice, even if you're not paying for anything for that advice up front. There's no point in me having a conversation with someone, giving them bad advice, and then their business being completely unsellable in 2 years' time. So he was quite conscious about it. And if you have a complicated business like his was, I would say at least 12 months in advance, you need to just talk to an expert and start making changes. Because you can have the conversation with me, and I think in this case, I think we literally went for lunch or had a couple of drinks. So it wasn't a long conversation. It might have been an hour. And in that time, effectively had a game plan. If you go to someone experienced, seen it all before, so I can say you need to do this, 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 this. But ultimately, I'm not the one going to go do it. So he still had to go away and do all the things, and they take time. Yeah. Hiring a good operations manager, even if you're paying $100,000 a year, is not that easy. Finding someone to come and run a podcast that isn't really run very consistently and isn't very well known is not very easy. So all of these things do take time. So say there isn't really a right or wrong answer, but probably the wrong answer is when your business is still really small and you want to sell for a lot.
Yeah.
A lot of people get obsessed over, like, I've seen quite a few people who every single month they'll write a blog post or send an email about like the update on how much they think their business is worth today. There's like current valuation 200,000, and then next month it's like current valuation 210,000. And while I definitely think there's an audience and demographic that find that interesting, I think if you just obsess over metrics like that and metrics that go into evaluation from day one, you might fundamentally build a bad business. Ultimately, I can give you I won't, but I could give you the formulas and models we use for valuing a business so that you could do it yourself or have a good chance of doing it yourself. But ultimately, like, people want to buy good businesses, and there's nothing that a fancy model with lots of numbers in it can tell you. They're all kind of things that make sense. Like, a business is worth more if it's growing. A business is worth more if customers leave good reviews and are happy. A business is worth more if customers come back and order again. So you can kind of track your valuation every month, but it's kind of pointless. You should spend your time focusing on things to make it better. Like, how can I get every month instead? I would suggest you spend your time thinking about what's one thing in my business, depending on the size of your team. I have 50 people. For us, every single week, every team tries to find at least one or two things they can improve slightly. And that might be across 6 teams. If you just have 5 employees, that's obviously unrealistic to have 6 departments making changes. So it might be, if you have a really small business, for him it was like once a month, do one thing and improve it. So figure out a way to get customers to leave more reviews. So often most businesses, you don't actually need to get better reviews. You just need to ask your happy customers to leave you a review. It's really not as difficult as many people think.
Okay.
So you can do these things and they really compound. So I guess the point is, think about it early, but don't obsess over it. Focus on building a good business. And then probably a year out, that's when you want to have a serious conversation.
Okay. So when people are thinking about how much their business might be worth, or when a buyer is thinking about how much to pay for a business, are they looking at any certain number of months in the past when trying to work out how much to pay for a business, or like judging the performance or growth of a business? 12 months, 24 months, 18 months? Is there a common number there?
Yeah, so I'd say firstly, again, it will depend on the buyer. As an M&A firm, when we look at a business, we primarily focus on the last 12 months. And if a business has been growing recently, we then focus more on a more recent period. So that might be 3 months. It might be, in the case of a recurring revenue business, so a SaaS business, or sometimes even service businesses, if they have like, they're delivering the same service every single month and people pay a subscription, we might just look at the last 1 month because that's the most reflective of where revenue is. And then we will extrapolate that out with effectively an assumed growth rate. And the valuation will be based on that. But generally, it's the last 12 months. Particularly, I would say in service-based businesses, they are prone to having spikes in revenue. So you might run a Black Friday promotion or something like that. You can't then sell your business in December or January and say, look how much we made in November. I'm asking for X times November net income. That's not really how it works. So generally 12 months. Buyers, particularly as deals get bigger. So I'll say once you get above the kind of 1 million level or 5 million level, so say 5 to 50 million, buyers want to start looking at 3 to 5 years of financial history. Not impossible to sell with less. If you want to have, say, we worked on a $30 million deal last year. He had about 4 years of history. So you don't need 40 years, but you probably need more than 3.
Yeah.
And then in smaller businesses, you can probably get away with less. If you're trying to sell something for $50,000, buyers don't need 10 years of tax returns. So I guess the nature of the industry, particularly the space we're in, buyers are quite sophisticated and they realize that the average small business owner does not keep meticulous records for the last 10 years for their business that makes $2,000 a month. So you have to be realistic in your expectations. I would say 12 months is a good period to look at. Can be less, can be longer. There's not really a right or wrong answer beyond that. It really depends.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. That's a good set of guidelines. So a smaller business, it might be less. For most businesses, think about 12, and the bigger businesses, they're going to need more years. I like that. One last thing on this case study before we move on to another one is you mentioned that this seller was really interested in getting a 7-figure exit, and mainly because he wanted to be able to say he could have a 7-figure exit. Yeah, I've seen that a lot too. If people are in a similar position where they want to have a 7-figure exit, are there some rough guidelines you can give them? I know we'd need a masterclass to go through a valuation methodology, but are there some rough guidelines you can give them for what their business might look like, or like can you set their expectations of what they might have to do, or what their business might have to be in somewhere in that range?
Yeah, for sure. So I'd say firstly with a service business specifically, and probably if you're listening to this talk or maybe some other relevant talks, you'll be less likely to fall into this category. But lots of service businesses are not sellable. And I guess, so in that case, the valuation would be 0.
Irrelevant.
So I would try and avoid giving a generalization, but let's say you do have a sellable business. The average service business will sell for somewhere in the region of 2 to 4 times your annual net income. Or you could also use the term seller discretionary earnings, which effectively, in very simple terms, is your net income not including what you pay yourself as an owner or owners, and anything else discretionary you take. So let's say you pay for a company car, or you pay for your personal vacation, or whatever, restaurants with your husband or wife or whatever it might be. That's all deducted out. Part of the reason I said net income rather than SDE with a service business is if you are still working full-time in the business as the business owner, a buyer will most likely look at a replacement cost. So they'll say, okay, well, on a discretionary basis, the business is making, say, $500,000 a year, but it's actually going to cost me $200,000 to bring in let's say $100,000, using my example. So that business, instead of making $500,000, is actually making $400,000 in the eyes of a buyer.
Yep.
That's somewhat already reflected in the multiple. So I start with a 2 on the multiple scale, which is already quite low. For example, if this was a SaaS conference, and we're talking about SaaS businesses, generally you would see nothing in the 2s. You look at kind of 3 and up for basically everything. But service businesses can be on the lower end of the scale across all the different business models we sell. So that would mean, I guess, at a really high level, if you have a business making somewhere in the region of 250 to 500,000 profit a year after paying yourself, you could have $1 million or a seven-figure business. And then in terms of how much revenue you need to be doing, that will really depend on what you're delivering. You could be delivering a service that has 10% gross margins because of the nature of what it is, or it could be 99% gross margins, or effectively 100% gross margins. So that really depends. So revenue is not irrelevant, but it's somewhat relevant. So as a guideline, 250 to 500, you're probably going to be in that 7-figure range. You could be higher up the scale, or you might not be there yet. So it will depend, but that's a good guideline.
All right, thank you for that. Yeah. Anybody watching, if you're not sure what margins means, I did a talk on day 5 all about margins, how to make them better, why they're important. And yeah, this is one of the reasons why they're important. If you're thinking about selling a business for 7 figures, then high margins means that you need less revenue in order to be able to hit that exit. All right, we better move on to another case study. So we just talked about one where someone had a personal brand, or like they were a seemingly integral part of the business, and yet they were still able to have a 7-figure exit. So what have you got for us next?
Yeah, so again, I've done so many over the years. An interesting one we worked on was, and I'm going to somewhat cheat because he started out as just having a service. Didn't do anything, but offered one service. It's actually like a really interesting service, and part of the reason, ironically, that we got connected, I was looking for the service, or we as a company were looking for the service that this business was offering. And we were like, this is exactly what we need. Amazing. And I think during the process of going through that, we started having a conversation with the guy delivering the service. And I think that the salesperson in me can't resist in asking, like, have you ever thought about selling your business? This is a great idea. When I find businesses, I'm a bit of a strange person when it comes to businesses I get really interested, and I want to learn everything about the business. And it's not because I want to necessarily sell it to them. I would love to, but I'll be like that annoying guy who keeps asking questions until you turn off Zoom and like, sorry, no more. So in this case, I was asking him, and he was like, oh, well, I don't think I could ever sell my business because it's really specialized doing this, and this. And I was like, well, why do you need to deliver the service yourself? And he kind of explained it was like super complex. And the reason we were trying to outsource it is because, quite honestly, I didn't understand how to do it myself. I thought it was too complex, too specialized. And they're like, oh, it's impossible. You need to hire an expert. So what he did, and what he realized, is that he could effectively turn his service into effectively like a productized service, or even course, where he turned 99% of what he did into a video course, because it was the same thing effectively over and over again. So if you want to sell a service business, maybe this is not exactly what you had intended for the summit, but it's what I'm thinking.
That's right. We did have a couple of talks about people who went from service to something else. So yeah,
Yeah,
go ahead.
you don't necessarily, just because you have a service business now doesn't mean you have to sell it as a service business. So what he did was he had his courses, and then you still got the service element in there because he had like a mastermind, which is relatively easy to sell and outsource because you just need to teach somebody a formula, and those people when they bought the course, I think you could just buy the course, or you could buy the course plus the mastermind. It might be $500 or $1,000. That worked really well. And then he also found, talking about margins, found some other good ways to make extra money. So in his case, he had the products he was using to deliver his service you needed if you were going to sign up for his service. So it's really simple. He was just an affiliate of these products and services that he was using on offering. And then he had that extra residual recurring income, which in a business sale is really important. If you've got recurring revenue in there, it's always more valuable than one time or kind of single income or whatever you might describe it from an accounting perspective. So he built up that, and I guess a lot of people think, oh, well, I have a service business, so I need to make all of my money from selling services. That's not really true. You can still make money elsewhere. That doesn't mean you suddenly don't have a service business. And I think the way he approached it is he realized that actually he could help, and he wanted to help people. He wanted to teach people. He had spotted a problem, identified a problem in the market, and wanted to make it better. So I think for him, the idea of launching a course, once he had successfully delivered the service for so long, he realized that he could reach way more people and make much more of an impact on, say, the world or the industry he was in, just by doing that. And because he already knew everything, it didn't take him very long to make the course. So it wasn't a year-long pivot. And this was not a particularly big business. So I'd say things I talk about, you don't have to be doing $1 million a year in revenue. In his case, he was doing 10,000 a month in revenue. It doesn't really matter how much you're making. You can still build something that's sellable, whether you're doing 10 million or 100,000. I would say as your business gets bigger, you almost need to not ignore my advice, but it becomes a little bit less relevant. So for example, in my business, we're a service business. We do nothing else. We just offer a service. But because I have 50 employees and team members to sell the business, while yes, there's an element that still relies on me, there's 50 people, and many of them would say, hey, Thomas is not good at his job. I could do his job, don't I? So there'll be people that will step up. If you have a much smaller business, in his case, he was just one person by himself. There's no one else who can step up and be like, I will do that. But as your business gets bigger, that becomes a little bit less relevant. So I'd say if you're doing, say, 10 million in revenue, you probably don't need to listen to this as much or worry about pivoting. You just need to think about, how do I get bigger? How do I get people recurring? So in his case, launched course. The business was super popular because it was solving a problem that people, as business owners, and the nature of the business owners we were selling businesses to, understood. They were like, oh wow, the business I already own or the business I'm thinking about buying would really benefit from this particular service. So when they realized it was in a course form, and what most people don't want to admit as service owners is that in most services, 95% of what you deliver can really be in the form of a course. There are very few services out there where you're particularly reliant on a level of skill or something that you can't necessarily get in a course. Particularly if you're just delivering like a thing. It's a bit different. Again, I keep using us as an example, but for us, if you want to sell a business, you need to have a network of investors. That's not something you can get from a course. But if you're just delivering a specific service, which is like, I don't know, I will rewrite your automated email sequences. That's just a one-time thing. You don't necessarily need to kind of have a network of people or whatever to do that. You can just go in, understand the clients, and go ahead and do it. So in this case, he made the pivot relatively quickly, launched the course, had some consistent revenue coming in. He could still offer his service if he really wanted to, but he was aware that that's not something that would sell with the business. So yes, from some perspective, that was like excluded income. Not entirely excluded, but effectively, because he knew a buyer was not going to come in and go deliver the same thing. So in his case, he made a quick pivot. he turned all of his knowledge from his existing service into a course. And if you're offering a service and people are buying it, then I would say in almost 100% of cases, someone will also want to buy that as a course. That's what he did. He knew where the customers hung out. He knew what the problem was. The course was super popular. And it kind of took off. And then he had a business that would sell. We didn't have to position it as a service business. We could sell it as a course business. So that's why I was talking at the start, how you can kind of cheat the system a bit and start with a service business, still have all the same skills, all the same people, all the same customers even, but sell it as a products business. And then from a buyer perspective, I guess you don't kind of have any alarm bells where it's like, oh, well, I don't know if I want to buy a service business, because they're buying the product and the IP behind it. And while that's not necessarily perfect, there are definitely some challenges selling a kind of a course business, particularly if there's videos in there that you've made. It's definitely better than a service that you're selling yourself. So yeah, this was a slightly shorter case study, but the reason I wanted to include it is I think it's important for people to realize that to sell your business, you don't necessarily have to sell it as is. You can change it. And that doesn't mean hiring people, like in the first example. That could mean you just change what you do and use what you already know to offer something that people will still buy. And then the thing he did really well was finding the other small revenue streams. So it might have been $10 of recurring a month here, $30 there. If you do that enough times, it started to add up. So I think by the time he sold the business, about 20% of his income was from recurring revenue from like residual sales that he had referred out to different places. So it doesn't sound like a lot. And when you start out, you probably make $50 in your first month and think that was a complete waste of time. Then the next month you might make 200, and then 300, and then 600, and then it can start to compound quite nicely. So that worked really well for him. That was a successful sale. It didn't take a huge amount of time. I think if you think about the amount of time it takes you to deliver your service, assuming you can figure out how to use like a microphone, a camera, most people have these things set up these days, particularly people working remotely at the moment. Everyone has some form of video set up effectively. You can make a course really quickly. That's what he did. So I think that's another good example, because you don't necessarily have to sell it as a service business. You can reposition just as quickly as it takes to hire an operations manager and a podcaster and all the other things we spoke about in the other business.
Yeah, I like that example. I think that's an important mindset shift for people, is that, you don't have to sell your business as it is right now. And if you're going to prepare it for sale, it doesn't necessarily mean only pulling yourself out of the business by hiring people. So with the selling a course rather than a service business, I imagine the multiple's a bit different.
Yeah, I'd say it's similar, to be honest, but maybe like slightly higher on average.
Okay.
But the thing that is improved by its very nature is the amount of time it takes. And this is definitely something buyers take into account, particularly in smaller businesses. The amount of time it takes is way less in the average course selling business. You might spend 1 hour a week, whereas you spent 40 hours a week before, basically making exactly the same amount of revenue. Again, as your business gets bigger, that becomes less relevant. So, for example, in the $30 million business we sold last year, the owner could have cost, I think they probably paid about $500,000 a year to replace the owner. But in a business already making multiple millions per year, that doesn't really matter. In a really small business, if a buyer has to come in and pay someone $500,000 a year to take over what the owner's doing, without, again, doing a valuation talk, most people realize that business is probably not worth very much. So that is one thing that changes with, even though the multiples might be similar, the amount of time it takes is significantly lower, which effectively means a similar course business and similar service business. The course business will generally be worth more, everything else being equal. Yes, there's lots of complexities to valuation, but the amount of time you spend as an owner, particularly the smaller the business is, the more relevant and important that is to think about.
Awesome. All right, we are coming up to time, so we probably don't have time for another case study, but I have a couple of questions. is there like the business is too small to sell threshold? Like, we can talk about multiples on net income, and let's say it turns out the business is worth 10,000 or 50,000 or 100,000. Like, is there a don't bother selling, it's too small right now, grow it a bit first? Do you have any suggestions?
So depends on your business model. If you have a service business, there's not a hard and fast rule. I would generally say you want to be making at least 100,000 a year or 10,000 a month in revenue. If you have, say, a Amazon affiliate review website, then there's no minimum size really. Like, anything will sell or be popular. But if you're delivering a service, I'd say at least 100,000 a year. The ideal level to get to, if you want something, I don't know if it's really a technical term, but very sellable, would be $1 million revenue. US dollars, I guess you can use any currency similar to US dollar.
Mm-hmm.
$1 million a year is a good level to get to, where, let's say you're running quite common, say 25-30% net margins, you're making 250-300,000 a year. That's a nice size where someone can come in and you could reasonably hire someone to run that business and still have some profit left.
Mm-hmm.
At 100,000 a year doesn't necessarily mean it's impossible. It's just going to be different. And if you're only making 100,000 a year, I'd say only, like 100,000 a year is still 100,000 a year.
Yeah.
If you're only making 100,000 a year, chances are you're doing all of that by yourself. Maybe you have a couple of outsourcers, but you're probably doing basically everything yourself. So the service they're buying is effectively just you. And
Yes.
selling you, in most cases, isn't really going to be worth much. So there's technically not a minimum size, but I'd say just generally the way service businesses tend to work, if you're making less than $1 million a year, it's probably so reliant on you as the owner or the founder, or maybe there's 2 or 3 or 4 founders. It's probably going to be difficult.
Yeah, that makes sense. I like the point. Like, if you've got a job rather than a business, no one wants to buy a job.
Yeah, people aren't buying jobs for sure.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a minimum sell. I forgot what my other question was, but that was a useful one. What about a minimum time period of being in business before thinking of selling? Like, let's say someone launches their business, the first 3 months go fantastically well. They have, 3 $10,000 months as soon as they launch. I imagine a buyer's not going to be so keen for that.
So like I mentioned when we was in one of the earlier points, I generally say we look at 12 months.
Mm-hmm.
So again, not impossible, but generally we won't look at anything below 12 months old, particularly if it's a service business.
Mm-hmm.
I would also say it's reasonably unlikely, if we're using the example of a desirable $1 million business or $1 million revenue business, it's reasonably unlikely you can get to a consistent run rate of $1 million within 12 months. That would mean you're doing 80,000 or so, 100,000 revenue per month to be at that level. That's probably quite unrealistic in that first year. Obviously not impossible. I know I certainly, in my first year, I was nowhere near that level. I don't think in year 2, it was nowhere near that level. So I'd say most businesses we see in the service space that are sellable at that level probably have at least 3 years of history. But it's definitely not a prerequisite. So 12 months is important, but I would argue that it's reasonably unlikely you find a business that's a year old that's done $1 million in revenue, has a team or like an ops manager or whatever in place, has sustainable way of bringing in sales and business that's not reliant on the owner. So yeah, hypothetically a year, in reality, you're probably going to be 3 years old as a business until you can sell.
Okay, that makes sense. Probably 3 years. Okay. So we're running close to time. Is there anything else that you want to share with people? Anything you want to make sure you can set their expectations right, or correct some misconceptions that people have, or any action items that you want to leave the viewers with?
Yeah, I mean, I think we covered quite a lot of good stuff. I'd say like the main thing to take away is if you're ever planning on selling a business, and if you own a business, you should think about selling it or being in a position to sell or exit one day. Firstly, it's never too early to think about it, but I would say it is too early if you're still trying to figure out how to make your first dollar. You don't need to be working out if your multiple is going to be 2.5 or 3. While it's important to kind of keep a mental track of your valuation, I would avoid being obsessed over it until you're quite close to selling. Just because what a lot of people do is they will forget to reinvest properly in their business because they're obsessed in like the net income that month. If you're not thinking about selling your business, it doesn't matter, and it probably should be making $0 per month net income, because you should be reinvesting everything you can afford at least, and hopefully you're taking a salary or a draw, a dividend or whatever it might be from the business. It should all be going back into growth. And if it's not, and you're like, okay, well, I made 10,000 net profit, my business is worth 300,000 because Thomas said so. Like, that's probably not the best way to do it. So people that obsess over valuation too early on can also forget to grow their business properly. So be aware, but also be aware that ultimately people just want to buy a good business. And then when you do want to sell, or you're thinking about selling, particularly with a service business, have that conversation at least a year in advance. It may well be that we have a conversation, you speak to me or whoever it is, my team, we say, you're good, just come back when you're ready and we'll sell it. This is what you're worth now. In 6 months' time, you're probably going to be worth this plus whatever. So come back. Or it may well be the most likely scenario is here's 3 things you have to do until your business is sellable. And while I wouldn't want to discourage people from listening what we've spoken about, there's a lot of, I guess, one case study is good, but every business is different. There could be a really minor thing in your business that you would not pick up on, or I could not physically explain in 1 hour, that could make your business unsellable. So have the conversation. Almost any good M&A firm or business broker will have a conversation with you for free early on. I'd say if they don't, they're probably not very good at what they do, because you make most of your money as a business broker or an M&A firm on the back end in commission and sale price. So start thinking about it reasonably early. Get good advice as and when you need it. But ultimately, and I would say this is really my advice of exit planning for any business, like focus on building a good business that gets better every month. Don't obsess too much over the valuation. Ultimately, if you have a good business that people come back and buy from again, leave good reviews, makes more money than it did the month before in every or most months, you probably have a good business that someone wants to buy. And if you don't do any of those things, then you probably don't. So it sounds super simple, but with exit planning and selling a business, most of the things you would think are true really are. There's not really many secrets in the industry that you really need to kind of pay us to find out. Like if it seems to you that the things you're doing are going to be difficult for someone to take over, or you can't train it to someone in your business, then if you can't train it to someone, how are you going to train a buyer or buyers to come in and do the same thing? So think about those things and think about, to the art of being good at many things in business. One, I think, a really underrated skill is being able to simplify really complex or complicated systems, process, knowledges, math, Excel, modeling, whatever it might be, to be able to simplify it and explain it in such a way, whether it's on a podcast, a blog post, a newsletter, in person, at an event, on stage, explain a really complex subject into something much easier to understand. So if you're really truly an expert at what you do, you should be able to train someone else as to what you do. So use some of your expertise to build those processes out so someone can come in and take it over. So that's about it. Like, keep it simple. I could give you a list of 20 things you should think about, but ultimately, if you can focus on those 3, you're probably going to be in a good spot.
Sounds good. All right. Well, thank you, Thomas, for coming on and sharing all of that with us. I did enjoy going through the case studies and hearing about those. Some good ideas in those. For anybody watching, if you want to learn more about Thomas and FE International, we're going to have some information about him and some links to click on to go get more info on the left. This was a short conversation. Thomas has got a lot of info to share, and unfortunately, I'm going to have to send you to like his blog and things to go find out a bit more about that, or reach out to him directly through the links next to this video. Also, below the video there's a button where you can come join the conversation in the Facebook group. If you have questions about this, or about selling a business, or anything that wasn't clear you want some clarity on, go pop the comments in there, and we may be able to twist Thomas's arm to come in and answer some questions.
I will definitely be there.
Awesome, thank you. Generous, I like it. All right, so with that, thank you everyone for watching, and thank you again, Thomas.
Thanks so much.